How difficult can it be to remain silent, especially when you are forced to remain silent? October 1895, London. In a small room of a small building on the narrow streets of the East End, in a cold room with an old bed, a thin blanket and a cracked window, the woman lying there no longer felt the cold. Mary Thompson was 48 years old but looked 60. Her face was wrinkled, her hands were calloused, her hair completely white. A maid's life had worn down her body, but what truly wore her down wasn't her body. As it could be for anyone, it was her conscience. Mary was dying. The doctors said tuberculosis. Her lungs were rotting, breathing became harder each day, perhaps a month, perhaps less. Mary knew, and she knew her time had run out. 30 years. She had carried a secret for 30 years. For 30 years she had remembered that moment every night, and for these 30 years she had been forced to remain silent. But now, as death approached, Mary made a decision. She would no longer remain silent. A young man entered the room. His name was Thomas Bennett, 26 years old, a young journalist. He worked at the Times in the crime reporting section. The neighbours had informed him, "Old Mary wants to talk. She used to work at a grand manor. She knows something." Thomas was sceptical. Old people sometimes saw visions, especially when death approached. But his journalistic instinct had brought him here. Perhaps there was a story. Mary was sitting up in bed, leaning against pillows, trying to breathe. When she saw Thomas, her eyes lit up. She tried to speak, but a cough seized her, and suddenly blood came to her handkerchief. Thomas waited. Finally, Mary composed herself. Her voice was broken and raspy, but determined in a way it hadn't been for 30 years. "I know something," Mary said. "I haven't told anyone for 30 years, but now I will." Thomas pulled out his notebook. "What do you know?" Mary took a deep breath. It hurt, but she continued. "In 1865, she said, I witnessed a murder." Thomas froze. Murder? 30 years ago. If this was true, it was big news. "Where?" Thomas asked. "At Ashford Manor," Mary said. "I was a maid there. I was 18 years old, and one night I saw Lady Catherine Ashford being killed." Thomas dropped his pen. Ashford. That name was familiar. It was a wealthy aristocratic family. But had there been a death in 1865? He couldn't remember. "Who killed her?" Thomas asked. Mary's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't answer. Not yet. "First, let me tell you the story," Mary said. "From the beginning. Because to understand that night, you need to know what came before. You need to know what that family was, and why I was forced to remain silent for 30 years. Thomas nodded, opened his notebook and prepared to write. And Mary, after 30 years, began to speak. The story Mary told would blow Thomas's mind. Because that night wasn't just a murder. There was betrayal, lies, and a decision that would change a young girl's life forever. And now, 30 years later, the truth would finally emerge. Mary Thompson was born in 1847 in London's East End, the sixth child of a poor family. Her father worked as a porter on the docks. Her mother sewed at home. 6 children, 2 rooms, never enough food. Mary remembered her childhood with hunger. At 12, she left school. She could read and write, which was considered a luxury, but the family needed money. Mary started working. Her first job was cleaning at a tailor's. 14-hour shifts, 6 days a week, 3 shillings a month. Mary didn't complain because in those days complaining was a luxury. At 16, an opportunity came. Her mother had heard of an advertisement. Ashford Manor was looking for a maid. A large aristocratic family outside London, a beautiful manor. Good wages, accommodation provided, meals included. Mary applied. Hundreds of girls had applied, but Mary was chosen. Why? Because she was quiet. She kept her head down. She never asked questions. She didn't stand out. In Victorian England, a perfect maid had to be this way, invisible. In the spring of 1863, Mary arrived at Ashford Manor. When she first saw it, her breath caught. A massive building, white stone, hundreds of windows, sprawling gardens. Mary had never seen such a place in her life, but the inside of the manor was even more impressive. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, gold-framed paintings. Every room was like a museum. Mary was afraid to touch anything. Everything was so expensive that if she broke something, she couldn't pay for it in a lifetime. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Dawson, greeted Mary with rules. There were many rules, and Mary listened to them all, took notes, memorised them. Rule 1. Never look directly at the masters. Rule 2. Never speak unless asked. Rule 3. Never interfere in the master's affairs. Rule 4. Never tell outsiders what you see or hear. Rule 4 was especially emphasised. What happens in this manor stays in this manor, Mrs. Dawson had said. Do you understand, Mary? Mary understood. The first days were hard. Mary would wake at 5 in the morning and work until 11 at night. Her duties were simple but endless. Clean the fireplaces, make the beds, prepare the dining rooms, polish the silver, wipe the stairs. But Mary didn't complain, because this place was heaven. There were 3 meals a day, there was a warm bed, and the wages were regular. Mary could send money to her family. Mary was happy. For the first time in her life, there was hope for the future. But she didn't know. In this manner, happiness was not permanent, and very soon something she would see would change her life forever. The Ashford family consisted of 3 people. Lord Edward Ashford, 50 years old, was the head of the family. He was a tall man with grey hair and a stern face. He never smiled. When he spoke, he gave orders. The servants feared him. Edward would ride horses in the mornings, sit in his library in the afternoons, and read the newspaper at dinner in the evenings. He never spoke to his wife. Lady Catherine Ashford, 45 years old, was Lord Edward's wife. She had been beautiful once, but the years had worn her face. Her hair was beginning to grey, there was sadness in her eyes. Catherine was often silent. She would sit alone in her room. The servants pitied her because it was obvious she was unhappy. And then there was Charles Ashford, 24 years old, the family's only son. He was handsome, dark hair, blue eyes, athletic build. But Charles was dangerous. Mary had understood this from the first day. Charles would look at the young maids, long looks, in a disturbing way. Mary would avoid him. But this wasn't easy because Charles was everywhere. One day Charles stopped Mary in the corridor. "What's your name?" he asked. Mary lowered her head. "Mary, sir." "Look at me, Mary." Mary raised her head. Charles was smiling, but his smile was cold. "You'll get used to this place," Charles said. "But remember, this is my house, and in this house, the rules are mine." Then he walked away. Mary's heart was pounding. What had he meant? But she didn't ask. Maids didn't ask questions. Mary would understand what Charles meant a few weeks later, and then she would also understand why other young maids left after a few months. By the summer of 1864, Mary had adjusted to the manor. She knew her work, she knew the routine. She had become friends with the other maids, especially one girl, Ellen. Ellen was 19 years old, a year older than Mary. She was a cook's assistant. She was cheerful, she laughed, she was hopeful about life. Mary loved her. One evening, Ellen told Mary something. "Stay away from Charles," Ellen said. Her voice was serious. "Why?" Mary asked. Ellen looked around. No one was there. Still, she whispered, "Because he's dangerous. Last year, a maid, Sarah, Charles did to her." Ellen didn't finish the sentence. Mary understood. What happened to Sarah? She was dismissed. The family said she had stolen, but the truth was different. Mary went cold. "Charles?" Ellen nodded. "Yes." And Sarah couldn't speak, because who would believe a maid, especially against an aristocrat's son? Mary couldn't sleep that night, she thought. If this happened to Sarah, had it happened to others? The next day Mary started being careful. She tried never to be alone with Charles, but in a manner it was impossible not to be alone. And then one day, Mary witnessed something that would freeze her. But that incident wasn't the murder. Not yet. It was something worse, being condemned to silence. In the fall of 1864, Mary was cleaning in the library. It was early morning. The masters hadn't risen yet. Mary was quietly dusting. Then she heard a sound. From the corridor. Shouting. A woman's voice. "Lady Catherine." Mary froze. Rule 2. Never interfere in the master's affairs. But she was curious. Quietly she approached the door. She listened. Lady Catherine was crying. "I can't take it any more, Edward. Enough." Lord Edward's voice was cold. "Control yourself, Catherine." "Control? Our son is a monster, and you're protecting him. Charles is young. Young people make mistakes. Mistakes? That girl is pregnant, Edward, and you dismissed her. Silence. Then Edward's voice, even colder. That girl was a maid. Charles is an Ashford. You will understand this, Catherine screamed. This is called injustice. This is called life, and you will accept it. Footsteps. Edward was coming out. Mary quickly retreated, picked up her cleaning cloth, and acted as if she hadn't heard anything. Edward stopped in the corridor. He looked at Mary. Mary, isn't it? Mary lowered her head. Yes, sir. How long have you been cleaning here? 10 minutes, sir. Did you hear anything? Mary swallowed. Her heart was pounding wildly. But she lied, because maids couldn't tell the truth. No, sir, I didn't hear anything. Edward looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded. You're a smart girl, Mary. Remember, in this house, you don't hear, don't see, don't speak. Yes, sir. Edward left. Mary's hands were trembling. For the first time she understood. This manor looked beautiful, but inside it held dark secrets. And now Mary knew a secret. But what could she do? Nothing, because a maid had no voice. That day Mary made a decision. She would ignore it. She would do her job. She would continue to remain silent. But fate had other plans, because a year later Mary would see something that would make it unnecessary for her to remain silent. But she would remain silent anyway, for 30 years. And now, on her deathbed, she was ending her silence. November the 14th, 1865, a Tuesday night. Mary would never forget. That day was ordinary. She woke at 5, cleaned the fireplaces, prepared breakfast. The masters were as usual. Lord Edward read his newspaper. Lady Catherine quietly drank her tea. Charles woke up late. In the afternoon, Mary cleaned the upstairs rooms. Bedrooms, guest rooms, corridors. She was alone. The other servants were downstairs. At dinner time, Mary helped in the kitchen. The meal was as grand as always. Roast lamb, vegetables, dessert. The masters ate in the dining room, the servants in the kitchen. At 9 o'clock, the servants finished their duties. Mary went up to her bedroom. It was a small room in the attic, shared with other maids, but that night Ellen was downstairs finishing the kitchen cleaning. Mary was alone. She looked out the window. It was raining outside. November darkness had covered the manor. Mary was tired. She wanted to sleep, but she heard a sound from below. Shouting. A woman's voice. Angry. Loud. Broken. Lady Catherine. Mary froze. Another argument. But this time the sound was different. More violent. What should Mary do? Rule 3. Never interfere in the master's affairs. But she was curious. Quietly she left her room. The corridor was dark. Only a distant candle was burning. Mary slowly walked to the stairs. The sounds were getting louder. They were coming from Lady Catherine's room, the large bedroom on the second floor. Mary went down the stairs. Her heart was pounding wildly. She knew that if she was caught she would be dismissed, but she couldn't stop. She entered the corridor. Lady Catherine's door was ajar. Light was seeping from inside. And the sounds. If Mary had stopped in that corridor and turned back, her life would have been different. But she didn't stop. She approached the door. And what she saw would change her life forever. Mary approached the door. Silently, she held her breath. Sounds from inside. Lady Catherine. Enough, Edward. I'm leaving this house. Lord Edward's voice was cold. You're not going anywhere. I am, and I'll tell everyone. What you are, what Charles did. No one will believe you, Catherine. You're a sick woman. Sick? You're the one making me sick. This family is killing me. Something broke. A glass? A vase? Mary didn't know. Then another voice was heard. Male, but not Edward. Younger. Charles. Mother, calm down. You monster. What did you do to that poor girl? I didn't do anything. That girl was a liar. A liar? She was 17 years old, Charles, and now she's on the streets. That's not my problem, Lady Catherine screamed. You... Then a noise, as if someone had fallen. Mary's breath caught. What was happening? The door opened a bit more. Wind. Mary could see. Inside, Lady Catherine was sitting on the floor, her dress dishevelled, her hair loose. Lord Edward was standing, his face bright red. Charles was in the corner, arms crossed, looking coldly. Lady Catherine was crying. "I'm getting divorced. I'll go to a lawyer. I'll tell everyone." Lord Edward approached. "No divorce, Catherine. There will be no scandal. The Ashford family doesn't create scandals." "Then I will." Edward bent down. He grabbed Catherine's arm, hard, painfully. "You won't do anything. Do you understand?" Catherine tried to scream, but Edward covered her mouth. Mary froze. Was this violence? But then something worse happened. Charles lunged forward. He grabbed his mother's other arm. Together they lifted Catherine. Catherine was struggling, but she was weak. The two men were strong. "Let me go," Catherine whispered. Her voice was hoarse. Edward didn't respond. He just dragged Catherine toward the bed. What should Mary do? Should she go in? Should she scream? But she was afraid, because she knew, if she revealed herself now, they could silence her too, so she hid. In the corner of the corridor in the darkness, but she was watching. Edward and Charles laid Catherine on the bed. Catherine was still struggling, but Edward took the pillow and pressed it against Catherine's face. Mary's heart stopped. No, this couldn't be. This... Catherine struggled. Her legs moved. Her hands grabbed Edward's arms, but Edward was stronger. He kept pressing the pillow. Charles helped. He held his mother's arms, and Catherine's movements slowed. Minutes passed. Mary didn't know how many minutes. Maybe 5, maybe 10. But eventually, Catherine stopped moving. Edward lifted the pillow. Lady Catherine was motionless. Eyes open but empty. Mouth open but no breath. She was dead. Mary wanted to scream, but no sound came. She was frozen with fear. Edward checked Catherine's pulse. He waited. Then he turned to Charles. "It's done," Edward said. His voice was flat, as if nothing had happened. Charles nodded. "What will we do?" "We'll call the doctor. We'll say heart attack." "Will they believe it?" "They will, because Catherine was already a sick woman. Everyone knew." Charles smiled, a cold smile. "Clever." Edward looked at him. "And you will never open your mouth. Do you understand?" "I understand, father." The two left the room. Mary retreated. She hid in the darkness. Edward and Charles didn't see her. They went down the stairs, went downstairs. Mary stayed there, trembling, wanting to cry, but unable to make a sound. What had she just seen? A murder. Lady Catherine had been killed by her own husband and son, and Mary was the only witness. At that moment, Mary had to make a decision. Would she go to the police? Would she tell? But Mary was an 18-year-old maid. Lord Edward was an aristocrat. Who would believe whom? And if she spoke, they could do the same to Mary. So Mary did nothing. She silently returned to her room, lay down in bed, and cried. The next morning, there was chaos in the manor. Lady Catherine was dead. The doctor came, examined her. "Heart attack," he said. "Unfortunately very sudden." Lord Edward was in mourning, but his eyes were dry. Charles looked sad. But Mary knew he was acting very well. The funeral was a week later. It was grand. Aristocrats came, mourned, made speeches. "Gone too soon," they said. "What a pity." But no one knew the truth. Mary served at the funeral. She carried trays, distributed tea, and said nothing. Because who would believe her? But Mary's conscience wasn't at peace. Every night she remembered that moment. Lady Catherine's struggle, Edward's cold face, Charles's smile. And every night she asked herself, "Why am I silent?" But she knew the answer, because speaking meant death. After November 1865, Mary changed. She was no longer cheerful as before. Ellen noticed. "Mary, are you okay?" she asked one day. Mary smiled, a fake smile. "I'm fine." But she wasn't. And for the next 30 years she wouldn't be. Because carrying a secret killed the soul. Slowly, a little more each day. Mary didn't stay at Ashford Manor. A month later she resigned. Mrs. Dawson was surprised. "Why are you leaving, Mary? Is there a problem?" Mary lied. "My family is sick. I need to return to London." Mrs. Dawson accepted. She wrote a reference letter. "You were a good maid," she said. I hope you'll be successful in your new job too." Mary thanked her and left. But the truth was, Mary couldn't stay one more minute in that manor. She saw Lady Catherine in every corner. She heard her scream every night. She returned to London, to the East End, to her family's home. Her mother was surprised. "Mary, why did you come?" "I quit my job, Mother." "Why?" Mary couldn't answer. What could she say? "I saw a murder but couldn't tell anyone." It was incomprehensible. "I just didn't like it there." Her mother was sad. "But the wages were good, Mary. What will you do now?" "I'll find a new job," and she did. But she no longer worked in manors, in small houses with modest families for ordinary people. The wages were lower, but Mary didn't care, because the real wage was peace of conscience. But Mary's conscience was never at peace. 1866, 67, 68. Years passed. Mary worked, earned money, survived. But she didn't live, because to live, you need to be free. And Mary wasn't free. She was a prisoner of a secret. In 1870, Mary was 23 years old. She was of marriageable age. Several men showed interest. Men looking for a clean, hard-working maid. There was one, Thomas Wright. He was a carpenter, 30 years old, a kind man. He loved Mary. He proposed marriage. Mary thought. Maybe if I get married, she hoped. Maybe if you start a family, you'll forget the past. But she refused, because she knew someone carrying a secret can't be happy with someone else, because that secret will always be between you. Thomas was disappointed. "Why, Mary, I love you." "I love you too, Thomas. But I can't marry." "Why?" Mary couldn't answer. Thomas left, and Mary was left alone. As the years passed, Mary got used to loneliness, because loneliness was safe. When alone, she didn't have to share her secret with anyone. But loneliness was also pain. In 1875, something happened. Mary saw news in the newspaper. Lord Edward Ashford has died, 60 years old, from a heart attack. Mary dropped the newspaper. Edward was dead. Her first thought, justice. God punished him. Her second thought, but I'm still silent, because even though Edward was dead, the truth was still hidden, and Mary still wasn't speaking. She read the rest of the news. Lord Edward's son, Charles Ashford, is now the head of the family. Ashford Manor and all properties have passed to him. Charles, that monster, now he had everything. Mary cried that night, because the world was unjust, and she asked herself, maybe I should speak now. Edward is dead. There's nothing to fear anymore. But then she thought, Charles is still alive, and Charles is more dangerous. So she remained silent again. 10 years had passed, from 1865 to 1875, and Mary was still maintaining her silence. But the secret was eating her alive. Her face had paled, her hair was greying, sleep never came. Mary's friends asked, "Are you sick, Mary?" "No," Mary would say, "just tired." But the truth was, Mary's soul was sick, and the only cure was to speak. But she couldn't speak. Not yet. 20 more years would have to pass. The 20 years after 1875 were a blur for Mary. Days blended into each other. Work, go home, not sleep, work again. Mary was now 30 years old but looked 40. Her hair had completely greyed. There were deep lines on her face. Her hands trembled sometimes. The doctor said, nerves. But Mary knew the truth. It was guilt. In 1880, Mary started a new job. She was cleaning at a small boarding house. The owner was an elderly woman, Mrs. Fletcher. She was kind, didn't ask too many questions. Mary liked it there. One day, Mrs. Fletcher asked, "Mary, why did you never marry?" Mary hesitated. There was no opportunity. Or, is there a heartbreak? Mary smiled. A bitter smile. There's something, but not love. Mrs. Fletcher was curious but didn't insist. I understand. Everyone has a past. Mary nodded. Yes, everyone had a past, but Mary's past was a ghost. In 1885, something shook Mary. A small news item in the newspaper. Charles Ashford has sold Ashford Manor. The new owner is an American businessman. Charles Ashford has moved to Italy. Mary read the news, read it again. Charles was gone. He had left England. Her first thought, now I can speak. Charles is gone. There's no one to fear. But then she thought, 20 years have passed. No evidence, no witnesses, only my word. Who would believe? In 1887, Mary turned 40. She was considered old now. Her body ached, her knees were swollen, her back was bent. Being a maid was hard work, and Mary had done it for 30 years. One day Mrs. Fletcher said, "Mary, you should rest now. Retire." "I have no money," Mary said. "I can't retire." "You can stay with me. I won't charge rent. You'll just do light work." Mary's eyes filled with tears. "Why are you so kind?" Mrs. Fletcher smiled. "Because you're a good person, Mary, and good people deserve help." Mary cried that night. Was she a good person? No. Good people don't remain silent. Good people defend justice. But Mary had kept this secret for 30 years. In 1890, Mary was 45 years old. She was no longer young. The mirror showed her a stranger, wrinkled, tired, finished. But the worst was her soul. Mary's soul was tired, because carrying a secret for 30 years was like carrying a mountain on your back, and Mary could no longer carry it. In 1893, Mary fell ill. At first it was a light cough, then it got worse. Blood started coming. The doctor came. He examined her. His face became serious. "Tuberculosis," he said. Mary wasn't surprised. In the East End, tuberculosis was common. It was the disease of the poor. "How long?" Mary asked. The doctor hesitated. "Maybe 2 years. Maybe less." Mary nodded. 2 years. It was enough. Because now she knew. She had to speak before dying. But to whom would she speak? To the police. Who would believe the story of a 48-year-old sick woman about a murder 30 years ago with no evidence? Then Mary found an idea. A journalist. Journalists loved stories. They loved scandals. Maybe someone would listen. In the summer of 1895, Mary made a decision. She was very sick now. She couldn't walk. She couldn't get out of bed. Her time was running out. Mrs. Fletcher asked the neighbours, "Does anyone know a journalist? Mary wants to talk." One of the neighbours knew. "There's a young man at the Times, Thomas Bennett. He writes crime news." Mrs. Fletcher sent him word, and Thomas came. October 1895. Mary on her deathbed. Thomas had his notebook open, waiting, and Mary, after 30 years, began to speak. "In 1865, I witnessed a murder." The words were difficult, but Mary continued, because this was her last chance. The truth would finally emerge. Thomas Bennett was taking notes in his notebook. Mary's story was incredible, but at the same time it was consistent. Details, dates, names, everything was in place. "Lady Catherine Ashford," Thomas said. "I can check the death record. November 1865, right?" "Yes," Mary said. Her voice was weak but determined. "November 14th. The official record says heart attack, but I saw. Not murder, not accident. It was planned," Thomas wrote. Then he asked, "Why didn't you tell anyone for 30 years? Mary smiled, a bitter smile. "Because I was nobody. An 18-year-old maid. Lord Edward was an aristocrat. Whose side would you take?" Thomas couldn't answer. Because Mary was right. In Victorian England, a maid's word was worthless. "What happens now?" Mary asked. Thomas hesitated. "I'll do research. I'll check the records. If I find evidence, I'll write an article." "There's no evidence," Mary said. "Only my word." "Sometimes words are enough," Thomas said. But they both knew. Probably it wouldn't be enough. Mary coughed. Blood came. Thomas waited. Finally Mary recovered. "There's one more thing," she said. "What is it?" "Ellen, my friend. She was there too. She knew things too. Maybe she'll speak." Thomas stood up. "What's Ellen's last name? Where does she live?" "Ellen Parker. I don't know where. Maybe still in London." Thomas took notes. "I'll find her, and I'll talk to you again." Mary nodded. "Hurry, because I don't have much time." Thomas understood. He said goodbye and left. Mary was left alone. But for the first time in 30 years she felt light, because she was no longer carrying the secret alone. Thomas started researching the next day. He went to the Times archives. He found the November 1865 records, and there it was. Lady Catherine Ashford, 45 years old, died on November the 15th, 1865. Cause, heart attack. Funeral, November the 22nd. Thomas tried to find the doctor, but that doctor had died in 1870. Witnesses, servants, they had all scattered. 30 years had passed. Thomas was overwhelmed. There was no evidence. But then he thought of Ellen. Thomas searched for Ellen Parker for a week. He scanned records, visited old servant bureaus, asked questions, and he found her. Ellen Parker, now Ellen Morris, was married. Her husband was a tailor. They had 2 children. They lived in North London. Thomas visited them. Ellen was now 49 years old. She had aged, but not as much as Mary. There was still vitality in her face. Thomas introduced himself. "I'm from the Times. Mary Thompson remembers you." Ellen's face changed. "Mary? I haven't seen her in years. How is she?" "Sick. Dying. And she wants to tell you something." Ellen was worried. "What?" Thomas carefully told her. Mary's story, Lady Catherine's death, the murder. Ellen slowly sat down. Her face had paled. "You knew, didn't you?" Thomas said. Ellen nodded. "I knew something, but not everything. Mary was very changed that night. She seemed scared the next day. Then she resigned. I understood that something had happened, but I didn't know what." "Now you know," Ellen cried. "Poor Mary. She carried it alone for 30 years. "Can you testify?" Thomas asked. "In court." Ellen hesitated. She looked at her husband. Her husband was worried. "If you testify," her husband said, "our family will be in danger. Charles Ashford is still powerful. Even if he's in Italy, he has connections." Ellen knew. But she also thought of Mary, her friend who had remained silent for 30 years. "I'll testify," Ellen said, "because that's the right thing to do." Thomas was hopeful. There were 2 witnesses now, Mary and Ellen. Was it enough? No. But it was a start. He deepened his research. He looked at old court records, Lady Catherine's will, and he found something. Lady Catherine had written a letter 6 months before she died, to her lawyer. The letter said, "If something happens to me, please investigate. My husband and son, I'm afraid." But the lawyer hadn't taken that letter seriously. Lady Catherine was known as a melancholic woman. The letter hadn't been considered evidence. Thomas found that letter in the lawyer's archive in a dusty file. Now there were 3 things: Mary's testimony, Ellen's confirmation, Catherine's letter. Was it enough? Thomas didn't know, but it was worth trying. Thomas wrote his article, long, detailed, careful. Every word had been checked, because if he made a mistake, the case would fall apart. Headline: "The 30-Year Secret, a Maid's Confession. Will the Ashford murder be reopened?" His editor read it. He was shocked. This is incredible. But if we publish, the Ashford family will sue us." "We have evidence," Thomas said. "Is it enough?" "I don't know, but it's worth trying," the editor thought. Then he agreed. Publish. And in November 1895, 30 years later, the truth emerged. The article had a bombshell effect. London newspapers repeated the story. The Ashford family, murder, 30 years of silence. The public was shocked. Did an aristocrat kill his wife? A maid was forced to keep this terrible secret for 30 years. Where is justice? Charles Ashford panicked in Italy. He sent word to his lawyers. Deny it. Call it slander. But it was too late. Because now not only Mary but Ellen was also speaking, and there was Catherine's letter. The police took action. Old files were opened. Lady Catherine's grave was to be opened. An autopsy would be performed. But there was a problem. 30 years had passed. No evidence remained on the body. Still, a trial was opened. The prosecutor said, "The witnesses and the letter are sufficient." Charles's lawyers defended. "There's no evidence, just the words of 2 old women. Inadmissible." The court debated. For weeks. Mary couldn't see the trial, because she died in mid-November. Her last words were to Thomas. Did the truth come out? "It did," Thomas said. "Everyone knows." Mary smiled. A peaceful smile. "Thank you." And she closed her eyes. Mary Thompson, 48 years old, died in a poor room in the East End, but she died free, because she was no longer carrying the secret December 1895, the court gave its verdict. Insufficient evidence. Charles Ashford is innocent. The public was outraged. There's no justice, they shouted. But legally the court was right. Because there was no autopsy, the eyewitness was dead, there was only circumstantial evidence. Charles Ashford stayed in Italy. He never returned to England. But society condemned him. His name was tarnished. No one wanted to associate with the Ashfords anymore. And that was a kind of justice. Ellen Morris spoke to journalists after the trial. Mary remained silent for 30 years because she was afraid, but until the very end she told the truth. This is her victory. Thomas Bennett wrote his final article. Mary Thompson was a hero, because in a world where the system was against her, she told the truth. She was late, but she spoke. And the public remembered Mary, not as a maid, as a hero. In 1920, Thomas Bennett was now 51 years old. He was still at the Times, but now he was the chief editor. One day, a letter arrived at his desk, from Italy. He opened it. Signature, Charles Ashford. The letter said, "Mr. Bennett, 25 years have passed. I'm now an old man, death is approaching, and I need to say something. Mary Thompson told the truth. I was there, my father did it, I helped. And she remained silent for 30 years, because we had silenced her. Am I sorry? Yes. But I'm too late. I don't expect forgiveness. Just put the truth on record. Charles Ashford." Thomas published the letter, and finally complete justice came. Charles Ashford died in 1921, in Italy, alone, cursed. No one put flowers on his grave, but at Mary Thompson's grave every year someone came, they left flowers, because Mary was remembered as a hero. For 30 years she told no one anything, but finally she spoke, and the truth, no matter how late, matters. Mary Thompson's story ends here. 30 years of silence, 30 years of guilt, and finally a truth spoken on a deathbed. But in the dark corners of Victorian England, there are hundreds more secrets buried. Stories of people who couldn't speak, victims who couldn't find justice, and truth spoken on deathbeds. If you want to continue discovering these kinds of stories, please like the video and subscribe to Victorian Secrets Untold, because in the next video I'll take you to another deathbed, another confession, another forgotten life. This time, the confession will come from a doctor, and the lie will be written on a death certificate. Some secrets can only be spoken with the last breath.